Hello. This isn't a bad way of making an entrance, is it? You might have heard this music before. It's used all over the place in films and TV programs, anywhere you need some drama, particularly perhaps a mad scheming scientist or terrifying phantom lurking in the shadows. I'm pretty certain you'll recognise it even if you don't know its name. It's the Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach, probably the most famous organ piece in the world. I'm David Hill. I'm the conductor and musical director of the Bach Choir. And this year we are celebrating our 150th anniversary. To mark the occasion, we've put together 3 special episodes of Change Your Tune about Bach and his music, and they're available in video as well as audio. Bach wrote over 1,000 works that we know of, though there were likely more that didn't survive. That includes around 200 cantatas, concertos for violin, harpsichord and orchestra, 6 cello suites, keyboard preludes and fugues in every key, huge choral works and countless organ pieces, motets and compositions for chamber groups. His work has been called everything from the voice of God to the backbone of Western music. Even if you've never been to a classical concert, the chances are you've heard Bach's music somewhere. At weddings, on film and TV soundtracks, on lullaby playlists. It's all over the place. I think it's safe to say that whatever music you like listening to, it wouldn't sound quite the same if J.S. Bach had never existed. So we reckon that you're more into Bach than you think. The Bach Choir doesn't just sing works by Bach, but we got the name The Bach Choir because we were formed 150 years ago to sing Bach's Mass in B minor for the very first time on UK soil. The concert was at St James's Hall in London, which is now a very posh hotel. The choir has been singing all kinds of music ever since, including Hollywood film scores, and with the Rolling Stones, that's us at the beginning of You Can't Always Get What You Want. But we've kept Bach's name in our title to mark the very special circumstances in which we were formed. We'll be talking about 2 of his greatest choral works, the St Matthew Passion and the Mass in B minor, in the other 2 episodes of this special anniversary series. To start us off, though, we're looking at some of his most famous pieces, choral or otherwise. We're trying to work out what makes them so popular and why Bach is such an influential figure in Western music. To help me do that, I'm joined by Linton Stephens. Welcome, Linton.
Thanks, David. It's a real pleasure to be here on this 2-time Silver Aria Award-winning podcast. Thanks for inviting me back.
Linton has been on Change Your Tune before, talking about O Fortuna from Karloff's Carmina Burana. He's a top-notch performer himself, playing bassoon with a variety of orchestras, as well as being interim deputy artistic director of the Cinque Orchestra. But he's probably best known as the presenter of Classical Fix and one of the hosts of Classical Live in the afternoons on BBC Radio 3. And more recently, the So Hear Me Out podcast, which he does for the South Bank Centre with Gillian Moore, which, just like Change Your Tune, is all about introducing people who think they aren't into classical music to the idea that they might be. So, Linton, I know we're going to get into more detail, but just at the start of all of this, and I know it's difficult, do you have a favourite piece of Bach?
That is a really tough question. But I think my favourite Bach it's the cello suites, and that's only because there isn't a lot of Bach stuff that's written for solo bassoon. In fact, I don't think there's any written for solo bassoon. However, the cello suites work really nicely on the bassoon. They're a real technical challenge, and they're just so satisfying to play. They're not written for our instrument, but it's a really nice way to explore and get to grips with and understand and become familiar with Bach's way of writing harmony into a single line. It's beautiful music.
I completely agree, and indeed we're going to be talking about the cello suites a little later. But why do you think Bach is so important?
I mean, he is. I'm not the first to say it, but he's the grandfather of Western classical music. There's a subtle genius in Bach. I mean, there's an obvious genius in Bach, but there's a subtle genius that, you know, can be appreciated by somebody who's just being introduced to him, right the way up to the most academic musician as well. There's something in Bach for everybody, I think.
So, some context. Bach was born in 1685 in the small central German town of Eisenach. Music was a family business. In total, more than 50 members of the Bach family were professional musicians. His father was the town's music director. His uncles were organists and composers and court musicians. He had a difficult start. He was orphaned by the age of 10 and he moved in with his older brother, Johann Christoph. His brother was his first music teacher. He studied keyboard, violin and composition, and it was the most important thing in his life. As a teenager, Bach actually walked 200 miles across Germany to Lunenburg to study at the music school there. In fact, as a young man, he wasn't known as a composer, but as an organist. People would travel for miles to hear him improvise, and he demanded high standards even if he was young. The story goes, he once got into a sword fight with a bassoon player because the man was playing badly. No one was harmed, fortunately. Linton, what do you think of that as a bassoonist?
Well, fortunately, nobody's ever brandished a sword when I've played a wrong note, and I've played a lot of wrong notes in my career.
Let's keep talking about Bach, because he was this, how would I could describe it really, his precocious talent, wasn't he? Not quite as young as Mozart in that sense. When you find children who seem to have a direct line to this incredible musical ability that most people take a lifetime to learn, what makes a musical genius, do we think? Would you say there are people around today that go in that category?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there certainly are. There definitely are. I think what makes a child special, a child musician special, is an early development of passion. I remember being not 8 or 9 years old and just being so fascinated by classical music, by the fact that 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 people can sit together doing different things and come together to make one incredible sound. And I think it's that passion that drives any young person to really want to advance, because then also they're not thinking about, I want to get better and be the best. They're just thinking about, I want to be able to do this and have more colours on my palette.
So most people believe this famous piece was written somewhere between 1704 and 1707, when Bach was a young organist in the town of Arnstadt. It probably started out as one of his dazzling improvisations, maybe played during a church service and noted down by one of his students. And you can hear that it might be extemporized. At this stage, I should say that some people don't believe it was written by Bach at all. They say it isn't typical of the kind of music he was writing at the time. Sadly, there's no signature on the manuscript that could settle things one way or the other. It's one of those long-running arguments in the music world, and I have to say, I think I'm on the side of it's probably not by Bach, but you know what? I like to think it might be. And what do you think about it, Linton?
Well, do you know what, David? I'm going to answer your question after you've answered my question, which is, why don't you think it was by Bach?
Because I think there are too many moments which tell me that he wasn't writing music at that time in this sort of style. It's sort of very free fantasia style, which he did occasionally, but he certainly wasn't doing it then. And the fugue subject is so kind of reminiscent of something that's crossing the violin strings. That, you know, you start
one into the same note
and go back to the same note. So a lot of people think that some of it was a violin work, for instance. And anyway, what do you think?
Your question was, does it matter? It doesn't matter to me. It probably doesn't matter to a lot of people. But for something to last 400 years That's a long time, and still be relevant, culturally relevant today. And outside of classical music circles, I think that is important. So it would be really nice for, if it wasn't Bach, for whoever did write it to get their flowers, for them to be acknowledged. Because if somebody else did write it as well, it's a piece of genius music. Wouldn't it be great to delve into what else they've got, what the treasure trove that they may have written?
I think we're in complete agreement. And by the way, for people who don't like organs, somehow they also like this piece. And it's a piece, as an organist, I still love playing.
It's such a fantastic piece. And I was talking about it on the radio just the other day. It's from the word go, it's so arresting. Imagine just starting a piece with 3 notes. Da-da-da. And almost anybody, classically trained, loves classical music, doesn't like classical music, play those 3 notes to almost anybody and they'll go da-da-da-da-dum-dum.
Yeah.
That is, I think there aren't many melodies that are iconic. That is probably up there in the top 10, if not the top 5 of iconic melodies ever written.
Whether he wrote it or not, it wasn't until the 19th century that it began to get attention, when composer Felix Mendelssohn revived Bach's music, and its dramatic feel caught people's imagination. And when soundtracks started being put on films, it was perfect for mystery and horror. It was used in early Dracula movies, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1932, The Black Cat in 1934. There's an orchestral version in the opening sequence of Disney's 1940 smash hit Fantasia, and it really hit mainstream with the 1962 film version of Phantom of the Opera. It's become a shorthand for something scary and demonic is happening, which is about as far away as you can get from this. Very different, but also very, very well known. Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring is actually the English title of the final movement of Bach's cantata BWV 147. This is the Bach Choir singing some of it. He started the work in 1716 and added to it in 1723, just after he moved to Leipzig as cantor of St. Thomas Church. We'll hear more about that part of his life later. It was written for the Feast of the Visitation, a church holiday celebrating Mary's visit to Elizabeth, the wife of John the Baptist. So it wasn't a concert piece. It was designed to be performed in church during an act of worship. There's something about the triplets, da 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 da, and the way the slow, beautiful melody fits over the top, that makes it so calming and uplifting. In fact, the main melody isn't Bach's. It came from a German composer called Johann Schopp, and it was written decades earlier. What Bach did was take that simple melody and elevate it. The musicologist Albert Schweitzer called it the expression of the soul at peace. Linton, what do you think gives it a particular appeal to people?
It's another example in Bach of a melody that transcends time, that speaks to an audience 400 years ago, 300 years ago, 200 years ago. Again, that was one of Bach's strengths, was the ability to write melodies that seemingly very simple underneath, probably a lot more complex, but these melodies that transcend time, which is just a real skill.
I
think.
completely agree. And he had an ability to, for instance, write one melody which everyone listens to and says, oh, that's amazing. And then suddenly someone starts playing or singing another one, and the other one doesn't go away. So this is also true of Jesu Joy, because you've got this oboe solo in this triplet rhythm, haven't we? And then suddenly, almost like a chorale, but it's so brilliantly pieced together, isn't it?
You know, being a bassoonist, very often my ear is drawn to the bass clef. And I think it's an element of music, especially music from that period, that we don't necessarily give that much attention to. It's a ground, it's a foundation on which everything else is built. Whereas Bach is actually taking you on a journey through your bass line and then doing something fantastic on top of it as well.
Yeah, and I think that relates back to your original point about the beauty of the melody.
Yeah.
Which just keeps coming, and then he changes the key, and then it keeps giving, and then it's
giving. That's a really important point.
Then it takes it all the way back to where he started.
You've gone on this really beautiful journey, and it feels really satisfying to come back. I think that's the beauty of Bach. Coming back home feels so satisfying.
My first ever memory of hearing classical music was in fact Bach. I was in my native Nigeria, a naughty little 5 or 6 year old. My parents had something to do, some social in the Anglican cathedral, and I kind of hung back and was playing around in the dust. Then suddenly the organ struck up. Jesu, joy of man's desiring. I froze, and I literally stood there. I can't quite describe the emotions. Even now I still remember it, possibly because they're the emotions of a small child. But it was just awe. I tingled. It was just amazing.
Bach was what you would call a family man. He married his first wife, Maria Barbara, a distant cousin, in 1707, and they had 7 children, but only 4 of them survived. In 1708, the family moved to Curtin, where Bach was to be Kapellmeister, music director at the court of Prince Leopold. Tragically, in 1720, Bach came home from a trip with the prince to find Maria Barbara had died. He was married again a year later to Anna Magdalena, a singer and musician herself. They were very happy and had 13 more children. That takes his total to 20, although only 6 made it to adulthood, a harsh reality of the times. Apparently, according to his biographer Peter Williams, Bach was a solicitous father, and he took a great interest in his children's musical education. Several went on to become musicians. His time in Curtin gave Bach space to focus on instrumental music. He was composing for the court and for some of the best performers in the country, and he took full advantage of it, creating some of his most famous works, including for one instrument in particular. This is the prelude from Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. It's one of the most recognizable works in classical music. There are 6 cello suites. They weren't well known during Bach's lifetime because they were considered practice pieces and exercises in musical expression without accompaniment. They only became famous in the 20th century when Spanish cellist Pablo Casals discovered an old edition in a second-hand shop and began performing them. Casals later said, "They are the essence of Bach and of music itself." That's quite a statement, isn't it, Linton?
Yeah, I mean, I said earlier, didn't I, that the cello suites are some of my favourite to play. The best place to play Bach is on a woodwind instrument or a bassoon. particularly for me, is a place that's very resonant, because what you start to hear around you is the harmony, the building of the harmony. There's a really unique length of time that the cello rings. You don't get that same resonance as a bassoonist. That's why it's great to play it in a big church hall or something like that. And you get that unique resonance on the cello. Your ears might not even be attuned to it, but you're getting this beautiful painting of harmony emerging as the player moves through the piece.
And do you think the point of the bow here being going across the strings gradually, da da dee da dee da dee da, there's almost a sense in which you're able to link the sound with the resonance that you're talking about, which then gives away also the harmony that is so intrinsic and a part of the whole thing.
There's something that when I teach, or when I higher level bassoonists, I always talk about the airflow on a wind instrument, and I say, imagine that you're a string player and think about how the bow moves on the string, to get a sense of line and legato, because of course that's visible on a wind instrument. It isn't. It's happening inside of our bodies. And I think one of the most beautiful things about watching string players perform is seeing the choreography of a piece of music, the dance, the physical dance that a string player does. And there's something really magical in these in these cello preludes, especially this one, about that choreography, about that dance. You see the player moving right up and down the instrument. It feels very organic and it flows so beautifully.
Of course, this prelude is extraordinary. It's innocuous. It sounds as if it's just very simple, and it is, of course. But then it starts to grow, doesn't it? And builds into this amazing climax, which is like arriving at the top of a mountain with the whole view set out in front of you. And then brings you back down and resolves.
I talked a little bit earlier about studies, and studies are pieces of music that are there for the musician, for one to master a certain thing about the instrument. And I think that's what's great about Bach. It's so satisfying to get your fingers and technique around the difficulty of it, and then to make the music in it.
My favourite non-choral Bach piece is the double violin concerto. I had the dubious pleasure of growing up playing the violin from a very young age, and I was not particularly good at it. But I have very, very fond memories of trying to play Bach's double violin concerto with my grandmother, who was a very good violinist. And I vividly recall the music actually making sense to me, even as a young boy, playing with my grandma the double violin concerto. It was one of the few violin pieces I took real pleasure in playing, and that music has stayed with me.
Of course, during this time, Bach was also composing for groups of musicians, and in 1721, he produced this. If you are of a certain age, this may take you straight back to Sunday evening TV, because for 13 years or so, it was the theme music, in a special Moog version, to the Antiques Roadshow on BBC One. It is, in fact, number 3 of Bach's very famous set of 6 Brandenburg Concertos. It's full of energy and joy, and its brightness comes from its unusual instrumentation. 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, bass and continuo, that's including a harpsichord. And it's a vibrant conversation of 9 string voices weaving in and out. The concertos gained their name because in 1721, Bach sent the manuscript to the nobleman Christian Ludwig, Margrave of Brandenburg. It seems that Bach hoped to impress him and possibly secure a new job. The collection became known as the Brandenburg Concertos because of this dedication, even though there is no evidence that the Margrave ever paid Bach, performed the pieces, or even listened to them. One of the most fascinating things to me, Linton, about these Brandenburg Concertos is, obviously he's trying to show off, we know that, but also just how different they are, in terms of the instruments chosen and so on, and the feel of them all. And this third Brandenburg Concerto, which, I don't know, maybe the most famous, I don't know. It's just fascinating, isn't it? Just how he used instruments in this particular one.
I think we think so often about ensembles and orchestras as this rigid thing. An orchestra is strings, woodwind, brass, percussion. We kind of have to acknowledge that although instrumentation was scored, very often composers were writing for what was around at the time, or the people that were around at the time. So the likelihood is that was what Bach had at his disposal, and probably had 3 incredible violinists at his disposal, and was making use of what was there. I honestly think that that's something that we've slightly lost in classical music now, is exploiting the instrumentation and the beauty of those combinations. So it's very much a thing now that if a composer's going to write, they're going to write for a string quartet, and it's going to be this combination. And actually there's a lot of creativity in utilising what you've got at your hands, and this piece is a perfect example of that. I've got 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos and a double bass. What can I write for this combination?
The second movement, that's an indicator that this was saying improvise and extemporize, and in the Baroque time that was something that everyone did.
Well, this is it speaks to my point that now there's a certain rigidity in classical music.
There is.
And I remember being at music college, and we had to do improvisation in our musicianship sessions, and most of the orchestral musicians were just like rabbits in headlight.
Yeah.
They were like, because they never had to do it.
Well, the thing is, of course, if even now we'd have to say the 2 areas of improvising that are taken that seriously these days are jazzers and organists at their best when they're doing it well. And the fact is, we don't do enough of it.
It's a shame that, because for me as well, the other side of this is, as an orchestral musician, we are mostly interpretive.
Mm-hmm.
And so improvisation is the place where, as musicians, we can be our most creative, and it's a shame that it's not as core a part of Western musical teaching as it used to be in Bach's time.
So let's go back to a piece with just one instrument. Broken chords or arpeggios that slowly build is something that Bach often makes use of. The C major prelude is the very first piece from a groundbreaking collection called the Well-Tempered Clavier. And a clavier is really any instrument with a keyboard, which in those days included the harpsichord, clavichord and early piano. He wrote the pieces for a good reason. At the time, tuning systems were limited. Instruments could only play in certain keys without sounding out of tune. Bach was fascinated by new tuning systems that allowed all 24 keys, major and minor, to sound equally pleasing. This was called well-tempered tuning. So he wrote the pieces as a musical demonstration of this new tuning idea and as a teaching book for his students. And it was a creative challenge, one prelude and fugue in every key, major and minor. It's a kind of musical map of all harmonic possibility. The collection became the basis of keyboard learning for centuries and continues to be. Later, composer Robert Schumann called Bach the father of harmony, which is quite an accolade.
It's unsurprising to us now to hear that kind of phrase, that Bach was the father of harmony, but he probably wasn't quite as well known as he is today in Schumann's time. Composers in the Baroque era were bound to certain rules when it came to writing music. Things you can do, things you can't do, moving certain ways in certain harmonies. But the genius in Bach is the way that he worked with those rules, maybe broke those rules. As we move through time, those rules become less rigid, and that's why we get different eras of music as well. In this day and age, we very much take for granted the fact that literally at our fingertips is the entire history of music. And I can log on to any of my music apps and listen as far back as anything has been recorded. But in their time, everything that influenced them was what was in their proximity or what they had access to.
Yeah.
And it was very, very different. And what always puts any artist at the forefront, I think, is how they take the rules that they have, take the influence that they've had, and create something not only unique but new. And so to be able to look back in the history of music and say, this is the first recorded example that we have of this happening in music. We find a lot of that in Bach's music. You know, that's what's so great about it.
Hello, I'm Rithala Shah. I present Calm Classics on Classic FM. For my favourite piece by Bach, I'm going to pick the Goldberg Variations, and that's because when I was a student and I was revising for my finals, I listened to an awful lot of Bach to help me concentrate. And although it's in some ways a difficult memory, revising's never that much fun, it's an example where music can make something that's a little bit challenging a lot more bearable, a very happy memory.
In 1723, when Bach was 38, he, Anna Magdalena and the family left Curtin for what most people think is the job that defined his career, being cantor of St. Thomas's Church in Leipzig. He stayed there for the rest of his life. It was a very demanding position. He had to teach music at the church, train choirs, play the organ for services, and compose a new cantata, that's a religious choral work, every week. It was during this time that he wrote some of his most important sacred works, including his B minor Mass, the work that brought the Bach Choir into being, and the St. Matthew Passion. I'll be talking about those in the other two of these special anniversary episodes. But he continued to write orchestral and instrumental pieces, including this, one of the most famous classical pieces ever. This is the air from Orchestral Suite No. 3 in D major. This slow, beautiful music is much better known than the rest of the suite, which is quite upbeat. Of course, if you've heard it before, you might say, hold on, surely that's air on a G string. And it is. But that didn't come until much later, in 1871, when German violinist August Wilhelmi arranged the piece so that the whole thing could be played entirely on the violin's lowest string, the G string, and that's what gave rise to its better known name. It's another piece of music you'll hear in a lot of popular culture, and if you're of a certain age, as I am, the piece is probably forever connected with Hamlet cigars.
This is a perfect example. I was telling you before, David, about Bach's bass line, that keep the piece moving. This is just a perfect example of it. The bass line is basically doing this bum, 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 bum. But it's just descending. But what Bach does is yum, yum, bum, bum, yum, bum.
Up an octave.
Up an octave. So he makes it more interesting. That draws the ear downwards and keeps the interest, whilst you've got this really beautiful, just hanging melody in the air, the suspended note. Yeah. Does that for ages, and then it kind of it keeps you up in the air, and then it just gives you a conclusion, and then it goes into another one.
Well, it is literally that suspended feeling, because it is what we call in music the tension of a suspension. He writes into it, and so you get this, where's this going? Oh, and then it resolves, and it keeps going. And then when he does move, it goes into the most wonderful melody. And
and it's so short and simple. And then it goes into another suspended note, and then he introduces another voice. He gets another voice doing something else. So I do a lot of illustration, and one of my favourite books is called Colour and How to Use It. It's by William F. Powell, and in it he talks about the use of colour in illustration and how one can use colour to change mood and things like that. But one of the exercises that he says to do is paint a whole picture with two colours. I feel like Bach does a very similar thing. He takes super simple concepts and paints these elaborate pictures with something that's so simple, one note and a bass line, and then a little bit later a response. He's able to create whole images, whole stories from something very, very simple. Like, that's brilliant. That is brilliant.
I think that sums him up. Actually, I think that's the genius in J.S. Bach.
I'm Anna Lapwood, and if I had to choose a favourite Bach work, I mean, it does change probably every week. And I'm going to cheat and say one organ and one with choir. So my favourite Bach organ work at the moment is the Dorian Toccata. It's such a fun piece to play, and it makes you feel so kind of powerful, and just moving through the fugue is such a beautiful feeling. But in terms of with choir, I think it probably has to be the St. John Passion. It's the first major work of Bach that I conducted when I first arrived in Cambridge 9 years ago. And I remember just living with this music for months and months leading up to it. And it was such an emotional thing to be a part of. Happy 150th birthday, Bach Choir.
His role as cantor of St. Thomas's Church was Bach's last. Towards the end of his life, he became ill and had big problems with his sight in particular. He died in 1750 at the age of 65. He left us some of the most influential and glorious music ever created. His importance wasn't recognised immediately, though. It was only much later, when composer Felix Mendelssohn had a Bach revival from the 1820s, that the world took proper notice of his genius. That's it for this special 150th anniversary edition of Change Your Tune from the Bach Choir. Thank you very much to Linton Stephens for joining us. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, David, and a very happy 150th anniversary to the Bach Choir.
Don't forget, you can catch Linton on Radio 3 in the afternoons and on his podcast, So Hear Me Out, wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you've enjoyed this edition and maybe discovered something you didn't know before about this iconic composer. Please join us next time when, with the help of the Bach Choir, I'll reveal some of the secrets of one of the world's most powerful choral works, Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Plus, to discover the stories behind some of the most famous choral pieces on the planet, things like Handel's Hallelujah Chorus, search for Change Your Tune wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about the Bach Choir, sign up for our newsletter. Each month you'll receive plenty of exciting choral content, including full-length concert videos and much more. I'll leave you in the ever-capable hands of Johann Sebastian Bach. Till the next time, goodbye.